So in this video, I have a very important update in a major case against a statewide ban on the possession and purchase of magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, and also the mandatory permit. The challenge has now been granted review by the state Supreme Court. So let's break down what is happening in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, I want to thank our sponsor, Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, don't just settle for any company. AOR is in a league of their own because they're an actual law firm. They're backed by their own attorneys. They have their own staff, and they can help you in situations that maybe other companies could not. And one of the great things about AOR is right now they've expanded a lot of their coverage, so you can get civil liability protection, red flag law protection, and a lot of other benefits that they've added to their membership if you sign up this year. If you're interested, check out AOR using my links down below in the details section, also in the pinned comment. And if you sign up and you use my code ARMSCHOLAR, you can get $50 off of your individual sign up plan or $25 off of a family plan. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a critical challenge against a state magazine ban and also the permit that they put in place for you to be able to purchase firearms. Oregon Measure 114 put in place a statewide permit to purchase and then also a magazine ban, and that was ruled unconstitutional and struck down in its entirety by a state court judge. That state court judge in the case issued a permanent injunction against that measure, and currently that's also still in place. The state of Oregon, in response, attempted to remove the permanent injunction through the appeals process. Well, recently, the Oregon Court of Appeals issued a unanimous order upholding the magazine ban and the permit process. So they found that the state could, in fact, put in place a magazine ban and then also a permit process. Now we received a notice from the Oregon State Supreme Court that they have granted review to this case, and now arguments have been submitted to the Oregon State Supreme Court involving the magazine ban and the permit challenge. Now, this case we're focusing on in the video is called Arnold versus Cotek. In response to this measure, the Arnold versus Cotek case was filed in a state court. Now, on review, Judge Robert Raccio ruled in this case, and he found that Oregon Measure 114 was invalid under the state's constitution and that it must be struck down in its entirety, and he did that with a permanent injunction. But of course, the story does not end there. Oregon then quickly appealed the decision up to the State Court of Appeals, and they even asked for the Oregon Court of Appeals to reverse the permanent injunction, during the pendency of the case, but that was rejected. Now, it's important to note that since this is a state court challenge under the Oregon State Constitution, there is a different standard for a state court to determine the constitutionality of that state law and essentially determine whether or not it violates the state's constitution. Under this standard, Oregon applies a two-phase test. Under phase 1, there is a determination of whether Article 1, Section 27 of the Oregon State Constitution even applies. Under the first phase, Oregon argues that Article 1, Section 27 does not apply at all, since they believe magazines are not arms and therefore they're not protected. The plaintiff in this case argues, of course, that that position is clearly incorrect and that these are protected arms and they're used to facilitate armed self-defense and other lawful purposes. The second phase of this test is almost looking at the public's interest in balancing the claimed purpose with the potential of undue burden, essentially balancing of interest and trying to determine, what is in the public's best interest and how far does it implicate the constitutional right under the state of Oregon's constitution. Of course, Oregon in their Measure 114 argues that the measure is in the public's best interest to stop crime. However, at the trial court level, the trial court judge found through expert testimony and data that the public harms that are claimed by the state of Oregon are overblown, and this measure does not meet any of those claimed interests. This case eventually made its way to the Court of Appeals, who recently decided to side with the state of Oregon and override what Judge Raccio said in his permanent injunction. They held that all of ballot Measure 114 is facially valid because the law is capable of some constitutional applications. So essentially they found since there is some constitutional application in this law, they would uphold all of the Measure 114. The opinion of the Court of Appeals stated that from the foregoing, the question we must address in this case is whether the enacting body here, the people of Oregon, enacted a reasonable regulation governing the possession and use of constitutionally protected arms in order to promote public safety without unduly frustrating the right to armed self-defense. When it came to the permits, they stated that the permit to purchase program and point of transfer background check reflect a contemporary legislative response to identifiable threats to public safety and a legislative determination that the risk of death or serious bodily injury to members of the public is increased by the threat posed by untrained and dangerous persons obtaining firearms. Therefore, they upheld the permit process as constitutional. On review of the magazine restrictions, they also stated that we observe that these magazine bans are a contemporary legislative response to identified public safety concerns stemming from the advancements in technology and the availability of those advancements to the public that had created observable threats to public safety. But now that decision by the Court of Appeals is up for review. The Oregon State Supreme Court will now hear oral arguments on this case dealing with the permit process and the magazine bans on November 6th, and then after that they will issue their ruling. The Arnold plaintiff also just submitted his opening brief, and in that he argues that consistent case law holds that the constitutional restrictions on arms must have pre-1859 historical analogs, demonstrating that Oregon's constitutional drafters understood these types of laws were constitutional. The court's case law identifies two types of analogous restrictions. One, laws prescribing dangerous manners of possessing or using arms. Or two, laws restricting certain groups of dangerous criminals, i.e. felons, from bearing arms. Defendants did not attempt to support any other historical analog. Also, consistent case law holds that prescribing the mere possession or use of protected arms is always unconstitutional. Rather than analyzing history or applying earlier holdings, the opinion adopted a subjective reasonability test foreign to case law and devoid of objective criteria. The opinion concluded that the Measure 114 is reasonable because it does not ban all firearms and eventually allows Oregonians to obtain firearms. Under the correct analysis, no Measure 114 provision is remotely analogous to any law upheld pre-1859. Moreover, because the opinion held that so defined magazines are constitutionally protected arms, the opinion should have adhered to the doctrine of stare decisis and held that Section 11 is unconstitutional. So this case is currently in front of the state of Oregon Supreme Court, and this is good news, especially for those of you in the state of Oregon. The state Supreme Court will now consider if the state can put in place magazine bans and permit restrictions, if they can put those in place, and if to do so would be constitutional under the state of Oregon Constitution. Now, the Oregon Supreme Court does in fact lean left, but regardless, this kind of cues up a major state magazine ban and permit challenge, kind of all wrapped into one case, and eventually will probably get elevated to the United States Supreme Court. Also, I do want to note that when it comes to the Oregon State Supreme Court in this specific case, in the past, they have denied, some of the requests by the state of Oregon. They wanted the Oregon State Supreme Court to step in early, and, at some levels of this case, but those were denied. So that could be telling as far as the Oregon State Supreme Court's interest in this case and maybe already where they're leaning because they've kind of gone against the state of Oregon in the past in this specific case. The best case scenario, of course, would be for the Oregon Supreme Court to find that Measure 114 is unconstitutional and therefore force the state of Oregon to seek Supreme Court review. And again, that would be good. And that would also be probably enticing to the United States Supreme Court if the state of Oregon is the one actually seeking the petition. However, that might be a long shot based on kind of the court makeup here in the state of Oregon, but regardless, this is still good news. And, this is something that is moving forward and it's seeking to strike down those state magazine bans and also the permit process that was put in place in the state of Oregon. So that's what's currently going on. Briefs are being submitted and the oral arguments are set for November 6th. And then we're going to see how this plays out after that. So as we get more information, as this develops, I will let you guys know. If you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is, of course, to subscribe to the channel. Also, you can check out my website, armscholar.com. There's a lot of free educational information over there and a lot of things that you can find over there. We also have the free legal guide. I will link that also down below. All you have to do is put in your email and we will send you a free PDF and then also do some follow-up email, to you guys. It's just additional free education if you want that additional education. But again, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by Armed Scholars and this nation will be maintained by Armed Scholars.